Millionaire rescues homeless family, then breaks down when he discovers their true identity. Alexander Rothschild, at 42, stood atop the gleaming skyscraper that bore his family name, surveying the sprawling cityscape of New York. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the steel and glass towers, a fitting backdrop for a man who had spent his life turning everything he touched into gold. Born into old money, Alexander had defied expectations by multiplying his inheritance tenfold through savvy investments and cutthroat business tactics. Impeccably dressed in a tailored Armani suit, he exuded an aura of power and confidence. His steel-gray eyes, which had stared down countless boardroom opponents, now gazed unseeingly at the bustling streets below. Despite his wealth and success, Alexander felt a gnawing emptiness that no amount of money could fill. Raised by distant parents more interested in social standings than familial bonds, Alexander had grown into a man who valued efficiency over emotion. His romantic entanglements were brief and transactional, leaving no room for lasting connections. The few who knew him well often remarked on his cold demeanor, earning him the nickname the Ice King in business circles. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, reminding him of a charity gala he was expected to attend that evening. He sighed, knowing it was just another opportunity for the elite to flaunt their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. Still, appearances had to be maintained. Little did Alexander know that this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he had carefully constructed. As he stepped into his waiting limousine, the universe was aligning to bring an unexpected twist into his meticulously ordered life. Across town, in a dingy alley far removed from the glittering world of high finance, a young woman named Sarah huddled in the shadows, clutching a whimpering infant to her chest. Her tear-stained face and disheveled appearance spoke of desperation and fear. Next to her sat a wide-eyed boy of about 5, his small hand gripping the hem of her tattered coat. Sarah, once a promising student with dreams of becoming a doctor, had seen her life spiral out of control after a series of unfortunate events. Now, homeless and at the end of her rope, she was about to make a decision that would irrevocably alter not only her fate but also the lives of the children in her care and that of a certain millionaire who was, at that very moment, sipping champagne in a limousine, blissfully unaware of the role he was about to play in this unfolding drama. The charity gala was in full swing when Alexander arrived, fashionably late as usual. He navigated the sea of designer gowns and tuxedos with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and business cards. The champagne flowed freely, and the air was thick with the perfume of wealth and privilege. As he made his way to the bar, he overheard snippets of conversation about the latest stock market trends and upcoming mergers. "Alex, darling," a shrill voice cut through the ambient chatter. He turned to see Vivian Hartley, a socialite known more for her scandals than her charitable works, sauntering towards him. "I was beginning to think you'd stood us all up." Alexander forced a smile. "Vivian, always a pleasure. You know I wouldn't miss an opportunity to support such a worthy cause." As Vivian launched into a detailed account of her recent cosmetic procedures, Alexander's mind wandered. He found himself questioning the authenticity of it all. The fake smiles, the hollow conversations, the pretense of caring about causes that most attendees would forget about by morning. Excusing himself from Vivian's company, Alexander stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The cool night breeze was a welcome respite from the stifling atmosphere inside. As he loosened his bow tie, his gaze fell upon the streets below, where the city's less fortunate continued their daily struggle for survival, oblivious to the opulence just a few stories above them. It was at that moment that a commotion near the entrance of the hotel caught his attention. Squinting, he could make out the figure of a young woman, disheveled and clearly distressed, trying to push past the doorman. In her arms was a bundle that Alexander realized with a start was an infant. Behind her, clinging to her leg, was a small boy. Intrigued and somewhat unsettled by the scene, Alexander made his way back through the ballroom and down to the lobby. As he approached the entrance, he could hear the woman's desperate pleas. "Please, I just need help. I don't know what else to do," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. The doormen, looking uncomfortable but resolute, were firmly but gently trying to escort her away from the premises. "I'm sorry, miss, but you can't come in here. This is a private event." Alexander felt an unfamiliar tug at his conscience. Before he could fully process what he was doing, he found himself striding towards the group. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his authoritative tone causing the doormen to step back respectfully. The woman, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear, turned to Alexander. "Please, sir, I don't have anywhere else to go. My babies, they're hungry, and it's so cold outside. I just need some help, just for tonight." Alexander studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the desperation etched into every line. His gaze shifted to the infant in her arms, then to the young boy hiding behind her legs, his small face a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. In that moment, something shifted within Alexander. Perhaps it was the stark contrast between the extravagance he had just left and the raw humanity before him. Or maybe it was a long-dormant part of himself, awakening after years of emotional hibernation. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Sarah," she replied, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "And this is Emma," she nodded to the baby, "and Jack," gesturing to the boy. Alexander took a deep breath, knowing his next words would irrevocably change the course of his evening, and possibly much more. "All right, Sarah. Come with me." Ignoring the startled looks from the doormen and the curious glances from other guests, Alexander led Sarah and the children to his waiting limousine. As they settled into the plush leather seats, Sarah looking around in disbelief, Alexander instructed his driver to take them to his penthouse. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alexander caught his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, as if the simple act of kindness had already begun to thaw something long frozen within him. Little did he know that this impulsive decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he inhabited. The ride to Alexander's penthouse was a study in contrasts. The opulent interior of the limousine stood in stark opposition to Sarah's worn clothing and the children's wide-eyed wonder. Alexander found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests, a mixture of curiosity and unease settling in his stomach. As they ascended in the private elevator to the top floor of his building, Alexander's mind raced. What had possessed him to bring these strangers into his home? He, who prided himself on calculated decisions and emotional detachment, had acted on pure impulse. The elevator doors opened directly into his sprawling penthouse, and Sarah gasped audibly. The space was a testament to wealth and minimalist design, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Alexander said, gesturing towards the living area. "I'll get you some water and see what I can find in terms of food." As he busied himself in the kitchen, he could hear Sarah's hushed voice comforting the children. The domestic sounds were alien in his usually silent home, and he found them oddly comforting. Returning with a tray of water, some fruit, and hastily assembled sandwiches, Alexander found Sarah perched on the edge of his designer sofa, looking utterly out of place. Jack was exploring the room with cautious curiosity, while Emma slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Thank you," Sarah said softly as she accepted a glass of water. I don't know how to repay your kindness." Alexander waved away her gratitude, feeling uncomfortable with the raw emotion in her voice. "It's nothing. Now perhaps you could tell me how you came to be in this situation." Sarah took a deep breath, and as she began to speak, Alexander felt his world tilt on its axis. She spoke of a life that seemed worlds away from his own, of growing up in foster care, of dreams deferred by unexpected pregnancy, of an abusive relationship she had barely escaped. "Jack isn't mine, biologically," she confessed, her eyes filling with tears. "His mother was my best friend. She didn't make it out. I couldn't leave him behind." As Sarah's story unfolded, Alexander found himself experiencing emotions he had long thought buried. Compassion, anger on her behalf, and a growing sense of shame at his own privileged detachment from the harsh realities many faced. But it was when Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled photograph that Alexander's world truly shattered. The image, faded and worn, showed a younger Sarah standing next to a woman who could have been her sister. And there, in the background, was a face Alexander recognized with a jolt. His own father. "This was taken at the children's home where I grew up," Sarah explained, unaware of Alexander's shock. "That woman next to me? She always claimed she knew my real parents, that they were wealthy people who had to give me up. I never believed her, thought it was just a kind lie to make us feel better." Alexander's mind reeled. The timing, the resemblance, it was all too coincidental. Could it be possible? Did he have a half-sister he never knew about? As the weight of this potential revelation settled over him, Alexander realized that his impulsive act of kindness had led him to a discovery that would change not only his life, but his entire understanding of his family and himself. The carefully constructed walls of his isolated existence were beginning to crumble, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay beyond them. Alexander's mind raced as he processed the implications of Sarah's story and the photograph. The possibility that she could be his half-sister sent shockwaves through his carefully ordered world. He found himself at a crossroads, facing a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. On one hand, he could dismiss this as mere coincidence, send Sarah and the children on their way with some money, and wash his hands of the whole affair. It would be easy to retreat back into his world of high finance and emotional detachment. But as he looked at Sarah's hopeful face and the innocent eyes of Jack and Emma, he knew he couldn't take the easy way out. Taking a deep breath, Alexander made his decision. "Sarah," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you. I think we might be related." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief as Alexander explained his suspicions, pointing out the resemblance and the timing that aligned with his father's known indiscretions. "I can't be certain without a DNA test," he concluded, "but I believe there's a strong possibility that we share a father." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process this information. The idea that her biological family might have been within reach all this time, that she might have a brother who was a millionaire, seemed too fantastical to be true. "If this is true," Alexander continued, his businesslike demeanor reasserting itself, "it changes everything. I want to help you, Sarah, not just for tonight, but permanently. We can get the DNA test done, and regardless of the results, I'll make sure you and the children are taken care of." The offer hung between them, a lifeline Sarah had never dared to hope for. But as the initial shock wore off, doubt began to creep in. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for us?" Alexander paused, realizing that he needed to confront emotions he had long kept buried. "Because," he said slowly, "I've spent my entire life building walls around myself, convinced that success and wealth were all that mattered. But seeing you tonight, hearing your story, it's made me realize how empty my life has been. Whether you're my sister or not, helping you feels like the right thing to do. Perhaps the only right thing I've done in a long time." As the weight of his decision settled over him, Alexander began to grapple with its consequences. He knew that opening this door would invite scrutiny into his family's past, potentially unearthing scandals that could damage the Rothschild name. His father, though long deceased, had carefully cultivated an image of respectability that this revelation could shatter. Moreover, Alexander's own reputation as a cold, calculating businessman would be called into question. The board members and shareholders of his company might view this sudden display of altruism with suspicion or concern. Would they see it as a sign of weakness, a chink in the armor of the infamous Ice King? Yet as he watched Sarah tentatively accept a sandwich and coax Jack to eat, Alexander felt a warmth spreading through his chest that no business deal had ever provided. The realization that he had the power to fundamentally change these lives for the better was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'll make some calls in the morning," he said, already mentally preparing a list of tasks. "We'll need to arrange for a DNA test, find you suitable accommodation, and sort out the legal aspects of your situation." Sarah nodded, still looking shell-shocked. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured. "There's no need," Alexander replied, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "For now, you and the children should get some rest. You can use the guest rooms down the hall." As he showed them to their rooms, Alexander's mind was already racing ahead. He knew that his decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Sarah and the children, but for himself as well. His carefully constructed world of spreadsheets and profit margins suddenly seemed shallow in comparison to the real human drama unfolding in his home. Later that night, as he lay awake in his bed, Alexander reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. He realized that in trying to help Sarah, he might just be saving himself from a life of emotional isolation. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential pitfalls and challenges, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt truly alive. As the first light of dawn began to creep into his room, Alexander made another decision. Regardless of what the DNA test might reveal, he would use his resources and influence to ensure that Sarah, Jack, and Emma had the opportunities they deserved. And in doing so, he would begin the process of redemption, not just for his father's past actions, but for his own years of indifference to the struggles of others. Little did Alexander know that his newfound resolve would soon be put to the test in ways he could never have anticipated. As Alexander navigated the complexities of his newfound relationship with Sarah and the children, a secondary plot began to unfold, adding layers of intrigue to their already complicated situation. Across town, in a dimly lit office, Detective Maria Gonzalez pored over a stack of case files. A seasoned investigator with the New York Police Department's Special Victims Unit, Maria had built her career on her tenacity and keen eye for detail. Her current case, however, was proving to be one of the most challenging of her career. For months, Maria had been tracking a sophisticated human trafficking ring that specialized in exploiting vulnerable women and children. Her investigation had led her to believe that some of the city's elite might be involved, either as clients or facilitators. The thought made her blood boil, but hard evidence had been frustratingly elusive. As she sifted through witness statements and financial records, a name caught her eye: Rothschild. It wasn't Alexander's name specifically, but rather a series of donations made by the Rothschild Foundation to charities that Maria suspected were fronts for the trafficking operation. Interesting, Maria muttered, scribbling notes. She knew the Rothschild name carried weight in the city, and if there was even a hint of connection to this case, it could blow the investigation wide open. As dawn broke over the city, Maria decided to pay a visit to the Rothschild Foundation offices. She didn't expect to uncover anything concrete, but perhaps she could get a sense of who was really pulling the strings behind these suspicious donations. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to both Alexander and Detective Gonzalez, another player was about to enter the game. James Hawthorne, an ambitious junior executive at Rothschild Enterprises, had been burning the midnight oil, combing through the company's financial records. He had long suspected that there were secrets hidden in the labyrinthine accounting of the Rothschild empire, and he was determined to uncover them. As he cross-referenced transactions and followed money trails, James stumbled upon a series of irregular payments that seemed to coincide with the charitable donations Detective Gonzalez was investigating. His heart raced as he realized the implications of his discovery. If he could prove any wrongdoing, it could be his ticket to the top, or his downfall if he wasn't careful. Back at Alexander's penthouse, Sarah woke early, still processing the events of the previous night. As she checked on the still sleeping children, she couldn't shake the feeling that her sudden good fortune was too good to be true. Years of disappointment and struggle had taught her to be wary of unexpected kindness. Padding quietly into the living room, Sarah was surprised to find Alexander already awake, engrossed in a phone call. She couldn't help but overhear snippets of the conversation. "Need it done quietly, understand? No press, no leaks," Alexander was saying, his tone serious. "Yes, I know it's unusual, but I need those records unsealed as soon as possible." As Alexander ended the call, he turned to find Sarah watching him, a mix of curiosity and apprehension on her face. "Good morning," he said, trying to sound casual. "I hope you slept well." Sarah nodded, then hesitated before asking, "What records were you talking about?" Alexander sighed, realizing he'd have to be honest if he wanted to build trust. "I was speaking to my lawyer. I'm trying to unseal some old adoption records. If we are indeed siblings, there might be some paper trail." I want to know the truth, Sarah, about all of it." As they talked, neither of them was aware of the forces being set in motion across the city. Detective Gonzalez was stepping into the Rothschild Foundation offices, her badge gleaming in the morning light. James Hawthorne was secretly copying files onto a thumb drive, his palms sweaty with nervous excitement. And somewhere in the shadows, the real architects of the trafficking ring were beginning to sense that their carefully constructed world might soon come crashing down. The stage was set for a collision of worlds: the glittering realm of high finance, the gritty reality of law enforcement, and the shadowy underworld of organized crime. And at the center of it all, a millionaire and a homeless young woman, bound by a shared past they were only beginning to uncover. As the days passed, Alexander found himself navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. The initial shock of Sarah and the children's presence in his life had given way to a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. He watched with fascination as his sterile penthouse was gradually transformed by the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of shared meals. Sarah, for her part, oscillated between gratitude and wariness. She was all too aware of the vast gulf between her life experiences and Alexander's, and she couldn't help but wonder if this newfound connection would last once the novelty wore off. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunset after putting the children to bed, Alexander broke the comfortable silence. "You know, I never realized how quiet my life was until you all arrived," he mused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Sarah smiled softly. "I never realized how loud mine was until I got here," she countered. "Sometimes I still can't believe I'm not going to wake up back in that alley." Alexander felt a pang of guilt at her words. "Sarah, I want you to know that no matter what the DNA test says, you have a place here, you and the children." Sarah's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from that first night. "You barely know us." Alexander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I suppose I'm learning that there's more to life than balance sheets and boardrooms. You've shown me a world I've been blind to for far too long." As they talked late into the night, sharing stories of their vastly different lives, a bond began to form. Alexander found himself opening up about the loneliness of his privileged upbringing, the pressure to always be the best, the coldness of his parents. Sarah, in turn, spoke of the hardships she'd faced, but also of the moments of unexpected kindness that had kept her going. The following days saw a gradual shift in their dynamic. Alexander, usually so confident in the business world, found himself seeking Sarah's advice on how to connect with Jack and Emma. He watched in awe as she navigated tantrums and tears with a patience he couldn't fathom. "How do you do it?" he asked one afternoon after she had successfully calmed a crying Emma. Sarah shrugged, a tired smile on her face. "You just do. When it's all you have, you find strength you never knew you had." Inspired by her resilience, Alexander began to make changes in his life. He started leaving the office earlier, eager to return home to the warmth of his newfound family. His employees were shocked to see the infamous Ice King smiling and asking about their families. For Sarah, the changes were equally profound. With Alexander's support, she began to dream again. She confided in him her long-abandoned hope of becoming a doctor, and he immediately began researching programs and pulling strings to make it a possibility. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened into a genuine sibling bond, DNA test results notwithstanding. They developed inside jokes, bickered over trivial things, and stood united in their care for Jack and Emma. One lazy Sunday morning, as they all sat around the breakfast table, Jack looked up from his cereal with a serious expression. "Uncle Alex," he said, the title they had settled on, "are you going to be our family forever?" The question hung in the air, laden with the weight of their unconventional situation. Alexander looked at Sarah, seeing his own emotion reflected in her eyes. "Yes, Jack," he said firmly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We're family now, all of us, and family is forever." As Sarah reached across the table to squeeze his hand, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. He realized that in trying to help Sarah and the children, he had found something he never knew he was missing. A true sense of belonging. Little did they know that their newfound happiness would soon be tested by the forces gathering outside their bubble of domestic bliss. The investigations of Detective Gonzalez and the scheming of James Hawthorne were about to intersect with their lives in ways they could never have anticipated, threatening to unravel the delicate bonds they had forged. The day that would change everything dawned like any other. Alexander was preparing for a crucial board meeting, adjusting his tie in the mirror as Sarah helped Jack with his homework at the kitchen table. The domestic scene was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Alexander opened it to find Detective Maria Gonzalez standing there, her badge glinting in the morning light. "Mr. Rothschild," she said, her tone professional but tinged with urgency, "I need to speak with you immediately. It's a matter of utmost importance." As Alexander ushered the detective inside, he caught Sarah's worried glance. He gave her a reassuring nod, though his own heart was racing. "Mr. Rothschild," Detective Gonzalez began once they were seated in his study, "I'm investigating a human trafficking ring, and I have reason to believe that the Rothschild Foundation may be inadvertently involved." Alexander felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. "That's impossible," he stammered. "We have strict protocols for all our charitable activities." The detective produced a file. "These donations," she said, pointing to a list of transactions, "have been traced to organizations we suspect are fronts for the trafficking operation. I need to know everything you can tell me about these decisions." As Alexander's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the allegations, the study door burst open. James Hawthorne rushed in, out of breath and wild-eyed. "Mr. Rothschild, I can explain," he blurted out, before realizing they weren't alone. "Who are you?" Detective Gonzalez demanded, rising to her feet. "James Hawthorne, junior executive," Alexander said automatically, his composure slipping. "James, what is the meaning of this?" James looked from Alexander to the detective, realizing he had walked into a situation far more serious than he had anticipated. I've uncovered some discrepancies in our accounts," he said, his voice shaking. "I think someone's been manipulating the foundation's donations." The room erupted into chaos. Detective Gonzalez fired questions at James, while Alexander tried to interject, his normally unflappable demeanor crumbling under the weight of the accusations. Attracted by the commotion, Sarah appeared at the door, Emma on her hip and Jack clutching her leg. "Alex," she called out, her voice laced with concern. "What's going on?" The detective's eyes narrowed as she took in Sarah's presence. "And who might be?" she asked, her investigator's instincts kicking into high gear. Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "I believe I can answer that," said an elderly man standing in the doorway. Everyone turned to see Wilson, Alexander's longtime butler, his usually impassive face etched with worry. "Wilson," Alexander said, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you talking about?" The old butler straightened his shoulders. "Sir, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you long ago about your father and about Miss Sarah." As Wilson began to speak, the room fell into a stunned silence. His words wove a tale of long-buried secrets, of a powerful man's indiscretions, and of lives irrevocably altered by decisions made decades ago. With each revelation, the world as Alexander knew it shifted on its axis. The trafficking investigation, the financial discrepancies, Sarah's mysterious past, all the threads began to weave together into a tapestry of truth that would forever change the Rothschild legacy. As the full impact of Wilson's confession washed over them, Alexander met Sarah's eyes across the room. In that moment, they both realized that the family they had built together was about to face its greatest test. The revelations brought forth by Wilson's confession sent shockwaves through the room. Detective Gonzalez, her investigation suddenly intertwined with a decades-old family secret, struggled to maintain her professional composure. James Hawthorne stood slack-jawed, realizing that his ambitious probing had unearthed something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Alexander, his world tilting on its axis, took a deep breath and made a decision. "Detective," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. But first, I need to understand exactly what's happened here." He turned to Wilson, his trusted butler of many years. "Wilson, I need you to tell us everything from the beginning. No more secrets." As Wilson began to recount the full story, Sarah moved closer to Alexander, instinctively seeking the comfort of her newfound brother. The children, sensing the tension in the room, clung to her legs. Wilson's tale was one of power, indiscretion, and cover-ups. He spoke of Alexander's father, Richard Rothschild, and a years-long affair with a woman from a considerably less privileged background. When the woman became pregnant with Sarah, Richard had paid her off and arranged for the baby to be placed in foster care, all to avoid a scandal that could tarnish the Rothschild name. "But sir," Wilson said, his eyes pleading for understanding, "your father regretted his decision almost immediately. He set up a secret fund, funneling money through various charities to try and provide for Miss Sarah from afar. I was tasked with overseeing these transactions." The pieces began to fall into place. The suspicious donations that had caught Detective Gonzalez's attention were not linked to human trafficking, but to Richard Rothschild's attempts to anonymously support his illegitimate daughter. James Hawthorne, seeing an opportunity to salvage his role in the situation, jumped in. "That explains the discrepancies I found in the accounts," he said eagerly. The money was being redirected through multiple channels to obscure its true destination. Detective Gonzalez, her brow furrowed in concentration, turned to Alexander. "Mr. Rothschild, while this explains the unusual financial activity, it doesn't entirely clear the foundation of suspicion. We need to trace every dollar to ensure none of it ended up in the hands of the trafficking ring." Alexander nodded, still processing the revelation about his father. "Of course, Detective. You'll have our full cooperation. I want to get to the bottom of this as much as you do." Sarah, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "I don't understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. If our father wanted to provide for me, why didn't he just acknowledge me? Why all the secrecy?" Alexander put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I wish I had an answer for you, Sarah, but I promise you, we're going to figure this out together." Over the next few hours, the penthouse became a hive of activity. Alexander's legal team was called in, financial records were poured over, and Detective Gonzalez conducted preliminary interviews with everyone involved. As the day wore on, a clearer picture began to emerge. While the Rothschild Foundation was cleared of any direct involvement in human trafficking, the investigation had uncovered a web of financial impropriety that stretched back decades. The attempt to secretly provide for Sarah had led to a system of obfuscation that had, inadvertently, created the perfect cover for less savory elements to exploit. Alexander, determined to make things right, made a bold decision. "Detective," he said, as the sun began to set on this tumultuous day, "I want to hold a press conference. We need to get ahead of this story." His lawyer blanched. "Mr. Rothschild, I must advise against that. The potential damage to the company's reputation is nothing," Alexander cut in, "compared to the damage of covering this up. We're going to tell the truth, all of it, about my father, about Sarah, about the financial irregularities, and then we're going to make it right." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide. "Alex, are you sure? This could change everything for you." Alexander smiled at her, a mixture of determination and newfound peace in his eyes. "It already has, Sarah. You and the kids have already changed everything for me. Now it's time for me to live up to the responsibility that comes with the Rothschild name." As they began to prepare for the press conference, Alexander pulled Detective Gonzalez aside. "Detective, I give you my word that we will cooperate fully with your investigation. But I have a request. Help us use this situation to bring down the real criminals. The traffickers you've been chasing, let's work together to stop them." Detective Gonzalez studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Mr. Rothschild, if you're serious about this, you could be an incredibly powerful ally in this fight." As night fell over the city, the Rothschild penthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers drafted statements, PR teams prepared for the media onslaught, and in the midst of it all, Alexander and Sarah sat together, two lost siblings finally found, ready to face whatever came next as a family. Little did they know that their attempt at resolution was about to open up a Pandora's box of new challenges and unexpected allies in their fight against the dark underbelly of the city's elite. The press conference that followed was a media frenzy. Alexander stood at the podium, cameras flashing, as he laid bare the Rothschild family's long-buried secrets. He spoke of his father's indiscretions, of Sarah's true identity, and of the financial web spun to keep it all hidden. "I stand before you today, not just as the CEO of Rothschild Enterprises," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "but as a man who has discovered the true meaning of family. I am committed to righting the wrongs of the past and using the resources at my disposal to make a real difference in the lives of those less fortunate." The room erupted into a cacophony of questions, but Alexander remained focused. He outlined a plan to restructure the Rothschild Foundation, promising unprecedented transparency and a renewed focus on combating human trafficking and supporting vulnerable populations. As the press conference concluded, Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had taken a leap into the unknown, risking his reputation and his company's standing, but he felt more alive than he had in years. Back at the penthouse, Sarah waited anxiously with the children. When Alexander walked through the door, she rushed to embrace him. "I saw it all on TV," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Alex, what you did, it was incredible." Alexander hugged her tightly, then knelt down to Jack and Emma's level. "We're going to be okay," he assured them all. "In fact, we're going to be better than okay." In the days that followed, the Rothschild story dominated the news cycle. While there was inevitable backlash and scrutiny, there was also an outpouring of support from unexpected quarters. Other business leaders, inspired by Alexander's honesty, began to come forward with their own stories of past misdeeds and commitments to change. Detective Gonzalez, true to her word, worked closely with Alexander and his team. The information uncovered during the Rothschild investigation proved to be the key to breaking open the human trafficking case she had been pursuing. As the dust began to settle, Alexander found himself at a crossroads. The board of Rothschild Enterprises was in turmoil, with some members calling for his resignation. But Alexander had a different vision in mind. "We have an opportunity here," he told Sarah one evening as they watched the sunset from the balcony. "An opportunity to redefine what it means to be a Rothschild, to use our resources and influence for real good." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Whatever you decide, we're with you." With that support, Alexander made the decision that would set them all on a new path. It was time for Rothschild Enterprises to evolve into something more than just a profit-driven corporation. It was time to build a legacy of compassion and positive change. As weeks turned into months, the transformation in Alexander's life became increasingly apparent. The once cold and distant CEO had become a man driven by purpose and compassion. He threw himself into the work of reforming Rothschild Enterprises, steering the company towards more ethical practices and socially responsible investments. One evening, as he sat in his study reviewing proposals for new charitable initiatives, Alexander caught his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him seemed softer somehow, the hard lines of ambition replaced by something warmer. He barely recognized himself, and yet he felt more authentically Alexander than he ever had before. Sarah, too, had undergone a remarkable journey of growth. With Alexander's support, she had enrolled in pre-med courses, taking the first steps towards her long-deferred dream of becoming a doctor. The confidence she had gained was evident in the way she carried herself, in the thoughtful contributions she made to discussions about the Foundation's work. "You know," she said to Alexander one day, as they worked side by side on a new outreach program, "a year ago I never would have believed this was possible. Not just the education and the security, but belonging somewhere, having a family." Alexander smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I know exactly what you mean. I had everything money could buy, but I never knew what I was missing until you and the kids came into my life." The children, Jack and Emma, had blossomed in their new environment. Jack, once shy and withdrawn, had become an outgoing and curious boy, always eager to learn about the workings of the business world that fascinated his Uncle Alex. Emma, though still young, showed a compassion beyond her years, often accompanying Sarah and Alexander on visits to the shelters and community centers supported by the Foundation. Even James Hawthorne, the ambitious junior executive whose digging had helped uncover the truth, had found a new direction. Alexander, recognizing the young man's potential, had tasked him with heading up a new division focused on corporate transparency and ethical investment. Detective Gonzalez, who had become a close ally in the fight against trafficking, often remarked on the change she saw in Alexander. "You know," she told him during one of their strategy meetings, "when I first met you, I thought you were just another rich guy trying to protect his assets. I've never been happier to be proven wrong." As Alexander reflected on the whirlwind of changes, he realized that the most profound transformation had been internal. The walls he had built around his heart over years of lonely success had crumbled, replaced by a genuine connection to the world around him. He thought back to that fateful night when he had impulsively invited Sarah and the children into his home. What had seemed like a momentary act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that had reshaped not just his life, but the lives of countless others touched by the Rothschild Foundation's new mission. "We've come a long way," Sarah mused one evening as they watched Jack and Emma play in the penthouse's newly child-proofed living room. Alexander nodded, a contented smile on his face. "We have, and we've got a long way to go yet. But for the first time in my life, I'm looking forward to the journey." As night fell over the city, the Rothschild penthouse, once a symbol of isolated wealth, now buzzed with the warm energy of family and purpose. Alexander Rothschild, the man who had once had everything and nothing, now understood the true meaning of richness. The story of Alexander Rothschild and his unexpected family served as a powerful reminder that true wealth lies not in monetary riches, but in the connections we forge and the positive impact we make on the world around us. In the years that followed, Rothschild Enterprises became a model for corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. The Rothschild Foundation, under the joint leadership of Alexander and Sarah, spearheaded groundbreaking initiatives in education, healthcare, and social justice. Jack and Emma grew up in an environment that balanced privilege with a deep sense of responsibility, learning from an early age the importance of using one's resources to help others. Sarah, now Dr. Sarah Rothschild, divided her time between practicing medicine in underserved communities and guiding the foundation's health initiatives. Alexander, once known as the Ice King of Wall Street, was now more often referred to as a philanthropist and reformer. He had discovered that the greatest satisfaction came not from accumulating wealth, but from using it to create positive change. The Rothschild story became a catalyst for a broader movement in the business world, inspiring other wealthy individuals and corporations to re-examine their priorities and embrace a more compassionate approach to capitalism. As Alexander stood on the balcony of the penthouse that had once felt so empty, now filled with the warmth of family and purpose, he reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a cold night. The city stretched out before him, a landscape of challenges and opportunities. But now, instead of seeing it as a battlefield for financial conquest, Alexander saw it as a community to nurture and improve. And he was no longer alone in that mission. In opening his home and his heart, Alexander Rothschild had not only found a family, he had found his true calling.